Let me tell you of my lord. Corax is an enemy of the oppressor. He is a friend of the people. He was raised by them, taught by them. In darkness, all men are equal, save those that embrace it. We are coming. Look to the skies for your salvation. In the myriad tapestry that is the original Space Marine legions, you are bound to find the one that resonates with you. For me, there is no chapter I love more, nor is more underrated than that of the Raven Guard and their Primarch, Corvus Corax. For the Raven Guard, it is that they rival the Salamanders for being one of the most humane Space Marine chapters, their focus on stealth, along with their timeless color scheme, and elite members being capable of the same psychic invisibility of their Primarch. For Corvus himself, if you're one of my regular viewers who watches for Conan content, I would actually say that Corax surpasses even Leman Russ for being one of the most Conan Primarchs in philosophy, in that he is a great liberator. Conversely, he's also loyal to his family, both rebel by adoption and imperial by blood. His ability to balance these two opposing moral components of his identity make him a truly intriguing figure in Warhammer lore, while also being the true Dark Knight of the Emperor's sons. As a warning before we begin, I claim no lore master status. I just really like these guys. Now, as we don our obsidian armor and stalk through the void of night to break the chains of the oppressed, repeat after me the statement of truth. Victorus aut mortis, victory or death, as we begin. If you'd like to see future videos a week early, along with other unique content, go to the subscribe star link in the description box, select any tier to contribute, and sign up as a member of the Grimdark Army. My thanks to the current men and women in service, whose names are seen here. Grimdark. Half off! This story is not one that should be told from the perspective of power, for that is not the way of the Wraith Slippers. Therefore, instead of starting from the perspective of the Emperor's sons, we will learn instead the origins of those first to don the armor of the 19th Legion, the Xeric warriors. Long ago on Earth, during the final years of the God-Emperor of mankind's unification wars, the world was in nothing short of a post-apocalyptic state. Across this barren hellscape roamed the technologically advanced surviving descendants of what would be the equivalent to our world, southern Russia and northern Mongolia. It is from these people that the culture of survivalists, known as the Xeric tribes, would be born. They were most known for being able to hold off a power roughly 20 times their size in military force, called the Indonesian bloc. This antagonistic area would be comparable to central China today if it stretched into the very tip of India. While their warriors came from a proud military history of psychological guerrilla warfare, a culture of survival against the harshest of elements, and had a good working knowledge of advanced technology, even they would fall to the Emperor's might. They were most likely exterminated, save for the firstborn sons of each family. The 19th were made for the same purpose as the Night Lords: surgical strikes, guerrilla warfare, and sneak attacks, something they were very used to. To become a Space Marine means that before the age of puberty, physical trials and surgeries to allow the body to not only grow in height, but fully scale up the physical form begin. The thickness comes with the height. These aren't slender men. The most important surgery in their patchwork of artificial organs is that of the gene seed. The existence of multiple tribes in the former culture implies some degree of genetic diversity. However, if there was any racial tension between them after the destruction of their parent culture at such a young age, their gene seed flaw would more than take care of it. I should mention that one theory about the Raven Guard holds that this flaw wouldn't show up until the 30K setting, so after the original founding of the Raven Guard. However, it is likely to me that since this actually correlates heavily with Corax himself, this was likely present in the original Raven Guard, or the 19th as they are called now. I have always held that the gene seed organ of Space Marines is something like a full replacement of the Y chromosomes the aspirant in question gets from their original father. It changes their personality to some degree and makes them resemble their Primarch. In the case of the 19th, every one of them develops albino snow-white skin with dark black eyes and hair. Along with this is an onset form of psychic traumatic berserker rage referred to as the Sable Brand. It involves developing latent psychic abilities to hear the whispers of the dead while being accompanied by a madness to not be able to tell the dead from the living. This is shown physically by the whites of the eyes turning a pitch black. The end result is a brother who no longer comprehends his own safety or desire to survive. They lose group coordination, causing them to become kamikaze lone wolf soldiers, slaughtering all in their path. Methods for dealing with this problem would not come until they would meet their Primarch, which would not happen for some very, very, very long time. The chapter culture of the pre-Corax Raven Guard was best described by the phrase, survival of the fittest. It was said to be based off an obsessive hatred of weakness to a detrimental degree, likely worsening the effects of the Sable brand. In addition to this, they had a very real sadistic streak, in which they would enjoy the fear and pain caused towards those they would conquer. The reason we're focusing so heavily on these aspects before the rise of Corax is to highlight just how day and night the cultural reforms will be once the Raven Lord comes into power. When one understands the totalitarian nature of the growing Imperium that without a doubt engaged in many forms of slavery and brutal worker exploitation in the industrial sector, which is likely where most jobs would be held, you understand the nightmare these people were living in despite their advanced technology. All this brutality and raw ugliness being paired with the majority of your family being killed before being brought into your current life, and the fear of becoming a cyborg slave called a servitor is then mixed with a hatred of legions like the Night Lords and the current 19th, who may well have added insult to injury by killing your family members in front of you and skinning them alive while wearing their face and laughing at you the whole time. The Old Guard's chapter culture was likely one of the main sources of resentment, thus motivation for joining rebellions in the Imperium for those who knew about them. Imagine being enslaved not only to those who defeated you, but to those who enjoyed your torture on a daily basis. To be endlessly tortured, oppressed, and humiliated. That third one being very important, as the first two are very common in the setting. That was the Old Guard of the 19th. One of the greatest weaknesses of many Primarchs, both loyal and traitor, was arrogance, giving them a great pride that often doomed them at the worst and was a great detriment to them at best. However, there were four who truly understood how to keep their egos in check. Sanguinius, due to his inherent understanding of the need for the preservation of culture, Vulcan, due to his adopted father, Roboute Guillimen, due to his adopted parents, and finally, a rapidly growing pale boy, who learned at a very early age the consequences of those in power abusing it. It cannot be said enough that Corvus Corax grew up in a mirrored version of the lives of those who were victims of the Old Guard. This would not occur on a planet in its own right, but a moon known as Lycaeus, which primarily was used for mining, being operated by slaves. In this parasitic relationship, the slaves would work endlessly while being tortured at the mercy of the merciless, to provide minerals from the moon to be used in industrial work, as well as food for their overseers, industrial workers on the planet the moon orbited, and the leaders of the intergalactic society known as the Tech Guilds. In short, the slaves and their masters lived on the moon, while the rich elite lived on the megacity-filled Earth-like planet it orbited, Kiavahr. The Pale Boy's soon-to-be adopted sister, Ephrenia, who, again, in the lore it says confidant or friend, but the truth is, they meet when they're literally very young. It would be the first person he would meet upon emerging from his pod, who he would later train to be one of his best spies and assassins. But it's his sister. She's treated like his sister. She's effectively the aunt of the Raven Guard. As a slave master tried to kill the girl, the nameless boy would rip off his head, offering it to her as a primal sign of friendship. The enslaved people saw the unusual event as a sign of a messiah, so named him after their words for savior, Corvus, and deliverer, Corax. They hid him from their masters, and with the aid of the Primarch's psychic invisibility, later called shadow walking, this would be successful. This was bolstered by the inherent power of all Primarchs to inspire awe in those around them, and likely also his rapid maturity, common to the godlike beings. The earliest years of the Primarch would be spent in darkness, and illuminated only by the light of the kindness shown by those who had been taught empathy through their own horrid abuse. While having vague memories of the number 19, which was his name under the Primarch Project, this was his home. These were his people being abused, and their common enemy to fight. I cannot recommend enough the books Deliverance Lost, Corax, and Corvus Corax, Lord of Shadows. All of these books highlight the nightmarish abusers that were the slave masters of Lycaeus in a realistic way without much context. Their abuse of their workers and slaves is very believable, as it follows the age-old piece of psychological wisdom that those who commit crimes against others that they know are wrong learn to hate them more, as they are a reminder of their crime and that they went unpunished. On a subconscious level, they are already villains of their own story, but have yet to admit it to themselves. This accelerates the abuse to an even more extreme degree. To understand this is to understand how these guards could beat a slave to death, or take a worker who couldn't meet an already impossible quota to the next step of abuse by getting them sent to the mines as a new slave. I'm focusing on this to tell you that if at any point you think this level of evil is cartoonish, remember that people have done far worse in real life, and still do if you know anything about blood diamond mining. Humans are social animals. The positive side of that is when we allow ourselves to feel the pain of others. That's empathy. The negative side is when we want others to feel our pain, thus take satisfaction and catharsis from it. Sadism. You do not need to be an alien psychopath to be a monster. And that's, I think, really part of why this chapter means so much to me. Originally, I was going to try to do an encyclopedic audiobook style format for these lore videos on Warhammer 40k. But with so much available lore already, I'm going to stick to what I feel most passionate about. And with the Raven Guard really is a story of slaves becoming the masters of their own destiny, and a liberation force, and possibly one of the only sub-factions in Warhammer 40k that I would consider genuinely good people. Violent criminals, wronged workers, and political advocates made up the ranks of the surrogate familial army under Corax that would liberate themselves from this cycle of abuse and the bloodiest conflict the moon had ever seen. This would be the first time, even in the midst of battle, that the internal conflict of Corax's morality would play a role. The violent criminals he worked with were cut from the same cloth as the men who tortured them. However, this would likely be the first time in their lives they had a healthy outlet for those impulses, leading to their crimes, and they had bonded with their new family in arms. After the people were liberated from slavery, Corvus would, at an unspecified time, meet his father, the God Emperor of mankind. Here he would be informed of the wider universe, including all the missing information about his own life. In this conversation, Corvus stated his life goal of bringing peace to both the planet of Kiavahr, which the moon they lived on orbited, and the moon itself, now renamed Deliverance. This is also when the Raven Guard would finally gain their namesake, being a reference to the iconic bird of Kiavaran culture. Continuing with our theme of moral complexity, and in direct opposition to his stated goal, would be his first ever war crime. He had taken the moon, but the tech guilds which ruled the main planet still held sway. With his rebel forces outnumbered, a section of the planet would be slaughtered, including his own men and many civilians, to win the war. Using the advanced device known as a gravity well, which kept the moon from leaving Kiavar's orbit, showing just how artificial the soon-to-be previous civilization of the planet was, Corax turned it into what was effectively a bomb, wiping out the tech guild leaders, but not without it weighing heavily on his mind. This is the moment I think that solidified in Corvus, beyond anything else, a live and let live morality or a hands-off approach to ruling. Because one thing we'll see, especially with the advent of our Kayvaan Shrike section of this video, is that Kiavahr culture was allowed to remain the same. There's almost a sense that after Corvus did this, his previous goal of conquest or a desire for conquest definitely left him, and what it was replaced with was an understanding of we can settle for doing what is right, doing what is good in the most surgical, precise way possible. A further compounding of the Raven Guard's main theme of stealth and kind of a natural morality that comes from reducing civilian casualties, but also a very Assassin's Creed element here. Everything is permitted, nothing is forbidden, just leaving people to their own devices. He's very much a lot like Leman Russ to some degree, a pro-freedom Primarch, which is very interesting. The end result of this was the pragmatic justification of thousands died so millions might live. And this was, again, this is something that's stamped on his mind as something that was an excuse that he did not exactly believe. The needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. In summary of Corvus Corax's early life, he learned the lessons of empathy, warfare, making tough decisions in morally gray scenarios, and through his life using his power of shadow walking, how to coach those with similar abilities, as well as associated mental health issues, such as the Sable Brand. He likely went through this himself, but with advanced Primarch intelligence and a higher fluid IQ, he was likely very quickly able to, in an autodidact manner, probably develop these natural skills that we're about to go into that teach people of the Raven Guard, who effectively are his sons. When we talked about a full replacement of the Y chromosome, I think that was very clear. To say sons, it's probably literal. That's my theory. Teach his sons how to control the Sable Brand, and probably teach any Psyker born with similar abilities, because this is a possible Psyker sub-archetype, then they could also use this as well. I also believe this revolution, which primarily used ambush tactics, would be when he developed the skills of Wraith Slipping, which would allow normal humans to mimic on a smaller scale his stealth-based skills. An aspect often made fun of with the Raven Guard is the fact that while being the scaled-up armored giants that Space Marines are, they engage heavily in stealth tactics. For most, this is due to that previously mentioned skill of Wraith Slipping. Similar to the techniques used by real-life ninjas of the 1300s when they had a disguise using armor, the body armor of a respective Wraith Slipper is filled with cloth and sand around the joints, covering both their scent and sound. In the case of the Raven Guard, they were also shrouded in all-black armor and operated usually at night in small numbers. From a practical perspective, the skill of Wraith Slipping, due to its use of cloth wrapping around the joints, would give extra support for pressure around that area, which I can confirm as an avid lifter and licensed strength coach. This would also help prevent overuse injuries on smaller muscle groups, in addition to the already present ridiculous advantages of being the permanently enhanced athletes that Space Marines are. When one pairs this with the special connection to their power armor through the black carapace implant, this sort of big stealthy boys meme, it becomes not only possible in the universe, but also very, very probable. As we mentioned in our section on Old Guard culture, the Berserk Lone Wolf rage known as the Sable Brand was a serious problem for the chapter up until this point. Wraith Slipping wasn't just a fancy skill, it was part of an internalized self-made culture Corvus took with him wherever he went. This was known as the Trifold Path of Shadow. On the 3 points of a trident or claw lie 3 paths. By choosing to dedicate your life to the martial pursuit of one of them, you gain a great advantage in battle, but also mastery over oneself. It was nothing short of a reinvented form of ninjutsu, but for an age of gunfire, virus bombs, and orbital bombardments. From here, terrorists would be turned into heroes. These 3 paths were ambush, stealth, and vigilance. In short, did you want to be a great tactician, assassin, or spy? All of which would require the fighting style and skills of Wraith Slipping, while also satisfying the reoccurring urges of the Sable Brand. This fixed the majority of those falling to the madness. It can be theorized that within all Raven Guard members, a latent ability for their Primarch's psychic invisibility exists, giving them that ever-so-slight advantage and guidance in their mastery of stealth tactics. This actually goes into what I always say when talking about 40k. It's a magical universe with a sci-fi coat of paint, not the other way around. However, for those who fully manifested the ability, they would be known as Mor Dathan in the Kiavaran language, the Shadow Masters. In the Raven Guard collection by George Mann and Joe Perino, we get a look at their special unit of the same name, which houses all those with this gift, very thematically similar to a Christopher Nolan Batcave in its headquarters. True to the spirit of the Legion, who do away with authority when needed, they are taken from all ranks regardless of previously held position and trained specially within the unit. And I actually want to take a brief break here to mention something that isn't in the script. And that is that something that you cannot get from a wiki, and something you have to get from noticing a pattern, is that Raven Guard do not develop normal psychers. They just don't. We're going to see this later with the Raptors, who develop literally their psychic invisibility is instead not replaced, but they have a special psyker unit, but the only thing the psychers can do is be better snipers from really far away. Raptors are a Raven Guard successor chapter, so they have the same gene seed. Now, when it comes to the Council of Nicaea, or Council of Nicaea, depending on how you want to pronounce it, that was the council to ban psychers. Now, when you understand that, you understand that the case, and also obviously the part of the Sable brand that's hearing the voices of the dead, you start to understand that the Raven Guard were sneaky in more than just one way. They were more like the Space Wolves and the Psychers of the Chagoris-based White Scars, in the sense that those both came from the respective Norse and Mongolian-influenced cultures and had their own cultural barriers on Psyker abilities. In the case of the Raven Guard, it's that their Psyker abilities, when manifesting, either turn out to be invisibility or something heavily based within the Trifold Path of Shadow. And that's why, another reason I wanted to make this video, the Trifold Path of Shadow does not get talked about enough when talking about the Raven Guard. The lifestyle of the Raven Guard does not get talked about, and we're going to talk about that later in the culture section. But this is a very big deal. When Psyker powers manifest within the Raven Guard, partially due to their training in the Trifold Path of Shadow, it always manifests in ability within that line, usually Shadow Walking or the Psychic Invisibility. So their loophole in the Council of Nicaea, which was more or less banning librarians, which were the magic users, effectively magic users, they were magic users, Psychers, in the various Space Marine legions, their loophole was that when their Psyker powers manifest, they aren't necessarily Psychers. They're just really good at sneaking, bro. They're just really good at sneaking. I don't know. It's just really good at sneaking. I don't know. It's just good at sneaking. No, they weren't good at sneaking. They're invisible. They're invisible. These members in the modern era would be assigned to those missions most crucial to the Raven Guard's chapter history, which we will get into later in the video. For now, they were merely the elite of the elite stealth masters, able to hide their presence from all living beings, only detectable by mechanical monitors like their Primarch. Outside of the chapter's apothecaries, who my headcanon says look like plague doctors in white ceramite, no one in the chapter knows of this company's existence, save for those that develop the powers themselves and thus are recruited. The new chapter culture was one informed by an empathetic connection to mankind, uncompromising practicality, and while not religious, a still spiritual view of martial self-discipline. As one could imagine, this new culture had no room for the flaws we so painstakingly covered in the first 3 sections of this video. To manage the Terrans, Corvus would construct the Deliverers, which were honored with the use of Terminator armor. The weight of the armor being something most other members of the Legion wouldn't have use for due to its tanky frame that can often restrict movement. This was a very smart political move, as no Terran could claim they were being disrespected due to the meaning of Terminator armor being associated with honor of veterans for any Legion. At the same time, 2 more advantages were gained. If the Raven Guard were ever in a situation where they were in a long-term conflict with an enemy that could adapt to their tactics, a good surprise would be the tank-like Terminators engaging in all their old tactics, as opposed to, obviously, the stealth the enemy would have been used to at that point. However, these Marines, unknown to them, were kept under heavy watch. They wouldn't see as much deployment as other companies, with the likely excuse being that the mission in question just wasn't important enough for warriors of their caliber. This is in line with the humility as pride attitude of Corax. Those even remotely thought of as possible traitors would be assigned to what were effective suicide missions, and simply never contacted again. At best, they would die with honor, and at worst, they were no longer around to be a voice of dissent in the new culture. In a rare case of Terran loyalty, the Marine who we get our opening quote from became the leader of one of the most iconic images of the Raven Guard. The Hawks, led by Sukuono, utilized jump packs and lightning claws to strike the image of their namesake into their enemies while providing support to other Talon companies. As a brief note, Talon companies are smaller than most other chapters' deployment strategies and are usually meant to be interchangeable in rank. Commanders are leaders, not rulers. Among the new and improved Raven Guard, as part of the overarching culture of the Trifold Path, new traditions like coming-of-age ceremonies or holidays would emerge as part of their chapter. With the majority of the recruits now coming from Kiavahan culture, much of that language would take the place where previously Xeric held sway. This not only reinforced their new culture, but also likely fed their human need for spirituality, allowing them to be not as susceptible to Chaos Lodges during the Horus Heresy. The oldest coming-of-age ritual in many cultures is a vision quest. In the case of the Great Liberators, their obvious animal guide is the raven, which is also their prey in a hunt. In actual spiritual practices, this is called active meditation. Of course, in our world, it's usually done through running or walking while also meditating. In this case, it's murder of the animal. Once the bird is caught, its neck is snapped, and its skull turned into a ceremonial decoration called a corvia. The corvia would be, for a young aspirant entering the Scouts, the same as a totem would be for some ancient tribes. When we understand the hallucinogenic aspect of most vision quests, when paired with the inherent mental illness of the Sablebrand, it may be that this is the first time any of the Marines encounter the issue, partially invoking it to override their immunity to most drugs. It may be possible that they are literally communing with the dead when undergoing this ritual. This theory of the Sablebrand being partially invoked carries over into our next tradition, the Rites of Shadow. In response to the voices of the dead being found in the Sablebrand, these rites focus on distilling the voices of the dead from the voices of the living, translated as the lies and truths of Shadow. To aid in concentration during this passive meditative period, the monk side of the warrior monks comes out, as they enter a temporary oath of silence, communicating only in a Raven Guard-specific sign language until it is completed. However, communication would not be done often, as the purpose of the rite would be self-control. In many cases, it also teaches them better fluency in the sign language called Corspake, so they can communicate tactically on missions, having fully fluent conversations without the need to utter a word. The emo stereotypes of the Raven Guard aren't without reason when compared to their less emotional cousins. While in the lore, their personality is often influenced by something called the Lore of Shadows, which is supposed to make them very stoically reserved, the Sons of Corvus are best described as somewhat bipolar in personality. This is because how they are written in any of their stories, it just doesn't match the Batman personality at all. A better comparison would be the Bat family. For every one Batman, you do have a few of them. You have 2 Dick Graysons, 3 Tim Drakes, things like that. If you know the comics, then playful ones, smiling ones, tricky ones, yada yada. This is well communicated in the Lord of Shadows. Again, it's just another shout out for the Primarch book. I absolutely love it. Where the Raven Guard can be very jovial with guests or when meeting normal humans, doing everything in their power to not seem like albino space murder hulks. Soon after, you learn from one of them struggling with the Sablebrand that behind each of those smiling faces is someone internally screaming. The Raven Guard have a very clear emotional intensity to them. Key aspect being self-doubt. It's a defining struggle for many Raven Guard members of the chapter. More specifically, self-doubt that piles up not from failure, but self-perceived failure. And there's a big distinction there, because as we'll see with the Black Guard later, that is a great example. Andri is a great example of someone who thinks they failed, but in reality was a tactical genius. And that happens with the Raven Guard a lot. There's a Raven Guard story, which I can't remember the name of, featuring the Minotaurs. And the Minotaurs save a Raven Guard. The Raven Guard is angry that they're not fighting an outright big bloody battle, because they're a newly ascended brother. They're angry that they're not fighting an outright battle with the rest of their seemingly brothers, because they feel a very real connection to the Minotaurs. So what happens is they have to have, like, the talk, and instead of sex, you learn about why it is good to be sneaky, and why you're not a bad person for moving through the shadows. It's okay, tiny Batman. And I'm joking, of course. The more direct quote is something like, they fight in their own way, as do we. So basically telling them, we are separate creatures, we ultimately operate in different ways, but it's good that you want to repay your friend. We will do so by fulfilling our duty as stealth units and stealth operatives. The reserved demeanor or stoic discipline I only ever see displayed when interacting with Marines from other chapters or when in combat, or with the special exception of the Shadow Masters, who are technically vigilantes within the Raven Guard, who are also a secret chapter, but are also more loyalist than normal loyalists, and have secret identities, basically. They're basically the Batman. Finally, the last of their emotions is the half-forced happiness and sense of humor as a self-defense mechanism they use with each other and outsiders when they are rarely social, to stave off the nightmarish depression. While they don't use this enough to call it a secret identity, I call it their Bruce Wayne state. Another thing I remember from Lord of Shadows is that they make their own wine, which is especially designed to be able to get them drunk as Space Marines, which has a lot in common with a sci-fi version of moonshine or prison toilet wine. Two brothers can be seen enjoying some as one of their friends comes in affected with the Sable brand. As a final note on their culture, they are taught to leave their dead to be eaten by the earth after stripping it of its usual armaments and gene seed. This is effectively a normal, holistic, animistic tradition of leaving the body to decay into the earth and energy to renew throughout the universe, which is, I assume, an extension of the animistic concepts already expressed, or the shamanistic concepts already expressed through the Vision Quest, and may speak to Kiavahr culture as well. Okay, moving on to Corvus and his brothers. Of the two Primarchs Corax was closest to, they would have to be Guillimen, who he trained with heavily after first taking command over the Raven Guard, and mysteriously Leman Russ, as he spoke fluent Fenrisian, which was not a common language even among the Primarchs. Much like Conan, he hits the cultural sweet spot of hanging around both civilized and savage warriors while wandering nomadically in search of proving himself to his spiritual father. For Conan, this is Crom, and for Corvus, this is redeeming himself in his own eyes as well as the Emperor's, but more on that later in the video. His relationship with Guillimen is the most fleshed out and well done. Their chapters together feel like a superhero team-up comic between Captain America and Batman. Their bond primarily comes from their love and mutual obsession over improving their practical tactics in battle. Corvus was said to beat Roboute in games of tactics no less than 3 times, which is a feat for anyone, as the Primarch of the Ultramarines is considered the greatest strategist of the Emperor's sons. This is also where I think Corvus truly earns his TTS portrayal as a comically intense, depressed emo goth. The two Primarchs are sitting in Guillimen's office, which is tailor-made for people their size, making them both feel more normal. All it takes is Roboute offering Corax some wine for him to enter a line of questioning that leads to asking if he's going to end up just as bad as Konrad Curze, the serial killer Joker Punisher Primarch. He's comically intense as a person, but it's that flaw that is very endearing about both him and his sons. Our flaws make us human, and I think for someone who grew up without a real dad, likely hears the voices of the dead, who he probably rationalizes as a form of madness, and could have easily developed extreme narcissism like the majority of his family, I think he and his kids are doing just fine. As far as Leman Russ goes, the Emperor's executioner was struggling with a prophecy, and to some degree had a death wish by wanting to tempt fate by using the weapon he was predicted to die with. Corvus, likely being intimately familiar with self-hatred, drops everything and instinctively starts speaking to his brother in his native tongue to be more relatable to him, and acts as his ally on the mission. This is very similar to real-life behavioral mimicry, which is one of the main skills used by anyone involved in conflict de-escalation. When trying to talk someone down from a suicide attempt, or stop them from doing something violent, the first thing you want to do is mimic their behavior from the side rather than the front, taking a position of an ally instinctively. This is that familial loyalty and empathy coming out in Corvus. We don't know how long they knew each other before this, or if they had training with each other, but both heavily focus on animal totems, have a deep connection to their adoptive culture, and utilize their unique takes on psyker abilities in their legions. Their compatibility is not unwarranted, and the Wolf Lord likely respects the different way the Raven Guard operates as just being a different animal that needs to fly as they need to run. This would be a view very in line with the poetic way Space Wolf culture operates. Similarly, when Corax is dealing with suicidal thoughts of throwing his own life away for a chance at what he views personally as redemption, a stoic conversation is had in which Corax initially chastises the Space Wolves for putting their lives in danger needlessly, then an injured Russ wakes up from beneath them, and in response to Corax screaming, "Do you want to die?" at the Space Wolves in question, he simply asks, "Do you?" implying the Wolf Lord can see right through Corax. Their love language is one of don't commit suicide, and I think we can all dance to that tune. Possibly the foundation of how the Raven Guard treats humans comes from the little girl who Corax would first meet and give that severed head to as a sign of friendship, Ephrenia, who, for all intents and purposes, is Corax's adopted sister. The Wiki says friend, but it's his sister. She would go on to join the Raven Guard as a human spy and assassin well into her old age. She was effectively the murderous aunt of the Raven Guard. This is very important, as she is effectively our only look at how Corvus treats his human associates. Well, that's not always true. He does interact with other people, and when he does, he's always trying his best to be humble and kind and show equality, but fundamentally, yeah, this is the only long-term human associate we know. They are agents of revolution, scouts before the Scout Marines, as I would put it. In the Raven Guard, they are treated no differently than a full Marine, which makes sense because the healthiest parts of Mafia culture without any of the negatives can be found here. They are liberators first, a family second, and an army third. This would be later bolstered by the Raven Guard's low numbers, which we'll talk about later in the video. Eventually, she would become the shipmaster of the Legion's battle barge, the Avenger. This is one of many things that points to our next section's theory. While not directly confirmed, there are no instances of the Raven Guard Marines being pictured with serfs, thinking of themselves as above normal humans. If anything, some likely think of themselves as abominations, sacrificing themselves for humanity through a savior complex, or ever employing others to take care of their armor, especially with all the personalized care that is required for Wraith Slipping. It's for this reason and many others we've already gone over that I have always just assumed there are no serfs in the Raven Guard. It seems implicitly communicated through every story featuring them without being said. Even their smaller deployed teams match up with this. For now, it's just headcanon, but it's very likely true. If they do exist, they're probably a loyalist version of the Alpha Legion informants and spies hidden everywhere. With all that fun slice-of-life stuff out of the way, we now come to what the Raven Guard likely refer to as the no-good, pain, suffering, oh god, why bad time, also known as the Dropside Massacre or the Battle of Istvaan. Let's talk about the where, who, and why very briefly. Istvaan 5 is a planet located just outside the territory ruled by the Ultramarines, the Ultima Segmentum, consisting of 500 worlds comparable to the 50 states of America mixed with Rome and culture. This means plenty of civilians despite it being a barren dead world due to the simple fact that the legions were already in the area. The arch-traitor Horus and his at this time still hidden allies with their associated legions would do battle with the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, with all three respective loyal Primarchs for each legion present. Already, it's very obvious that the loyalists were outnumbered and caught off guard. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, who was known for his blunt nature, took point as lead tactician. This would be the trio's first mistake, as both the Raven Guard and Salamanders were used to very different styles of warfare than the Iron Hands. The Salamanders couldn't form a defensive posture focused on keeping as many civilians alive as possible. The Raven Guard couldn't utilize guerrilla tactics when being forced to charge in. Lastly, the Iron Hands, while working with legions they were on good terms with culturally, we do see some training exercises between the Raven Guard and the Iron Hands in the Ferrus Manus book, I believe. They did not have a lot of experience in joint exercises with them. Outnumbered and poorly coordinated, the conflict would soon devolve into an every man for themselves situation. While all three legions were harmed by this, the Raven Guard would have it the worst. It would all begin with a surprise retreat from their enemies. At this time, their infrastructure-providing Primarch, Perturabo, was still thought to be on the side of the Emperor. He was not. The Raven Guard would learn this the hard way, as they were gunned down in the cruelest of surprise attacks. The ambushers were ambushed. This would see 10% of the already reduced in number by battle legions' ranks destroyed. It was then that the others revealed themselves in a bloody assault. The Night Lords and Alpha Legion were a good pairing to counter the stealth tactics of the Raven Guard, virtually nullifying any strategic advantage they could muster. The Word-Bearers under their Primarch, the insane man-child Lorgar, would then directly attack, sending Corax into a brutal rage. While he nearly killed Lorgar, the fight would be interfered with by Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords before the Raven King could deliver the finishing blow. By the end, only 4% of the Raven Guard would be left. So, once a legion that grew in number dramatically due to its safer, more practical tactics, was now the smallest legion among the remaining loyalists. This would birth one of the most common battle cries of the Legion: for Istvaan, while also reinforcing them using in majority their Mark 6 Corvus power armor due to its obvious inspiration, lightweight, and ease to repair. If you want something that's lightweight and easy to repair, you'll probably want today's sponsor, very relevant for this video. Ronin Kraft is an independent 3D model printing service with an excellent customer service score on Etsy. He's a great way to build your Space Marine army much cheaper than competitors. He's actually helped me build my own Raven Guard successor chapter, the Celestial Eagles, which I couldn't have done without him. With Ronin Kraft, you can be sure you'll get quality that surpasses any master. Sponsor link below. With the time we've spent building up the familial aspect of the Raven Guard, you can imagine that the tragedies they suffered did not sit well with the tyranny-hating, suspicious of authority Corax. If one group of legions were traitors, what about the rest? What did the Emperor do to inspire such a large rebellion? If the Emperor did not do what he did next, Corvus would have likely become the first renegade Primarch. However, after losing half of his kids to the influence of a magic murder force working through an insane version of his formerly favored son, Big E woke up to maybe sharing more with his kids. This would also be a situation the Emperor would at least be psychically aware of and couldn't avoid sympathizing with. So the Emperor projected himself fully in a calming way with all his psychic might, and gave his son knowledge of how the Primarchs themselves were created, while also demonstrating tender compassion for one of the rare times in his life. Through this, Corvus was able to clone new Space Marines closer to his own genetic structure. The specifics are not given, but if this does follow the same scientific process as the Primarch project, the Marines in question born from this would be Gilgamesh figures, in the sense that they would be 3/4 their Primarch instead of only half. These recruits would reach maturity faster, thus would be ideal for rebuilding the Legion. It's the Star Wars clones, but stronger because Space Marines. However, adding crippling insult to severe injury, the Alpha Legion would successfully sabotage these efforts with demon blood. They used demon blood, which was really cool, by the way. The end result would be clones turning into horrid abominations. That's because of the demon blood. I just want to reference demon blood because it sounds really cool. Many of these are still sealed away in the Raven Spire, their fortress monastery on the Moon of Deliverance we painstakingly covered earlier, which is also theorized to be haunted by those clone Marines who died horribly in the process of mutating. By the end of this second phase of the Raven Guard's darkest hour, their lower numbers and slow recruitment would become a permanent part of their identity, never to reach their former glory. Horrified by what he viewed as his own fault despite the sabotage, just as his sons are wont to do, he left in a state of self-exile. Likely, this was to redeem himself in his own eyes by gaining a mastery of his own connection to the warp, given both the reason the abominations were formed and the special hatred he would now have for demons at this time. His only note upon leaving was, "Nevermore." This is another sign pointing to what is effectively a self-imposed training arc in the Eye of Terror, which is a large part of space contaminated by chaos. Primarchs, being inherently magical beings themselves, only contained by the clone vessel of another being who is able to ascend to godhood, it can be reasoned that when the Primarchs unlock their true forms, they effectively become smaller human gods. If we are to apply this theory, then it would make the God Emperor of mankind the god of humanity as a race, and his sons subsections of this, descendant from the emotions of humanity and their interactions. In the case of the demon Primarchs, it can be argued that these are corrupted versions of their true forms that would likely resemble more pure mythological creatures if purified. In the case of Corax, he openly describes himself in his new form in the following way, while still slaughtering his way through demonologist word-bearers and his dark god-worshipping mentally ill brother. "I am what I have always been. I am vengeance incarnate. I am justice delivered." He's Batman. He's fucking Batman. "Underneath the veneer of humanity our father crafted for us, we are of the warp. I swore to destroy all chaos taint from the galaxy. You will be the first fallen brother to die beneath my blades." While not confirmed, Corax has elevated to the state of God Primarch, either being of human vengeance or human justice, depending on your interpretation. We also have a third one we're about to get to. He is the first loyal Primarch to do so, and while he has not yet reunited with his chapter, he has succeeded in his training arc. He is a Super Saiyan Primarch Super Saiyan with Ultra Instinct. He unlocked his Primarch Bankai. Choose the power-up metaphor that works for you. He's at a minimum faster and stronger than he was, but beyond that, we don't know what his new powers are. There is an ever-expanding list of them. When he does finally come home, the training regiment he'll be able to put the Raven Guard through will likely get rid of any remaining weaknesses the chapter would have. Both they and I long await this day. It's also very possible that he now possesses the secrets to cure or reshape the Raven Guard abominations into something truly human. As a final note for this section, while it is true that the Raven Guard, like all chapters, started as atheistic, and they're often represented as atheistic by many lore YouTubers, but the problem is I don't find a lot of evidence for that. You can actually see modern references to them literally praying to Corvus and referencing him as a god of redemption when the Raven Guard interact with different successor chapters. This is often done alongside the God Emperor of Mankind, meaning effectively that the 40k Raven Guard are worshippers of Corax and the Emperor, whereas the 30k Raven Guard were not. So the Raven Guard from the Horus Heresy were not worshippers of the Emperor, obviously. But in 40k, it does seem like they do venerate and literally do pray to Corax. Wielder of the Lightning Claws, forged by his Primarch, known as the Raven's Talons, and inheritor of the will of the chapter, is the Master of Shadows, Kayvaan Shrike. Not to be confused with the Shadow Masters, which are Shadow Walkers. Shadow, who is one of the few Raven Guard who made his name by bullying orcs to death. Considerably unprepared for the hit-and-run tactics of his company, the orcs of Targus 8 would make a horrible mistake by shooting down their transport. Shrike was effectively made for the Raven Guard, having an unwilling childhood controlled by gang violence but possessing a noble heart. In short, he was no snitch. After rival gangs put him through a brutal torture to give up information on his allies, even at a prepubescent age, likely around 8 or 9 years old, he didn't give them up. His first name showcases his sentiment and honor towards his old life, as it is likely the name of the gang he once worked with. Even before this, he was scouted by the Raven Guard for his natural ability as a runner or messenger. His skill at hiding and negotiation made him a prime candidate. Kayvaan would effectively apprentice under the previous Master of Shadows, who was also one of the few Raven Guard to be written as the mysterious stoic stereotype they are talked about being in the fluff. Corvin Severax looked like a carbon copy of Corvus Corax himself, scaled down. Eventually, he would be killed by the supreme commander of a detestable, unlikable blue-skinned race called the Tau, after successfully killing the leader's decoy. Kayvaan, overcome with grief for his master's death, would also adopt the same brooding demeanor in his modern state. One way to describe him would be like if Jason Todd from the Bat Family was much better written and didn't have the pointless conflict over not killing with Batman. Night Lords vs. Raven Guard is a fan-favorite matchup, but I'd personally love to see Kayvaan specifically have interactions with Jago Sevatarian, being from a gang culture himself. It really is a shame that we aren't given more of a look into the psychology of this character. As a brief note on Kiavahr itself, the Raven Guard home is on the moon right next to this world, which means Kiavahr, other than being a forge world, is free to maintain a lot of its normal culture. It might seem like retreading, but we also know that it has forests, hive cities, and really feels like a second space Gotham after the destruction of Nostromo, or maybe a space Detroit when it was still known for making Lincoln cars. Its streets are plagued by gang violence, and uniquely fast animals dot the less developed parts of the landscape. I really like the superhero dynamic of the world, and the simple excuse of the Raven Guard not being directly on the planet, along with their tactics in general as an excuse to allow this sort of unique world to remain relatively untouched. Something that's very appealing to me, especially for a recruiting world, which also is likely one motivation to leave the people to decide their own fate in majority, in an Assassin's Creed-esque, all things are permitted, nothing is forbidden fashion, to help weed out potential candidates, caring more about the freedom of the people than efficiency, which I like. Obviously, each of the Raven Guard successor chapters deserve their own video, but in their own way, each also highlights a particular trait of the main chapter. That's the aspect of each we will be focusing on with the few I've selected for you today. Obviously, highlighting stealth would be the camouflage-colored Raptors chapter. A fan favorite of many, they embody the practicality of the Raven Guard through their reliance on sniper rifles and their most famous quote, "Before seeking victory, first, make yourself invulnerable to defeat." They are effectively the Raven Guard if instead of being ninja-like, they were instead army sniper-like. Very cool with a very sweet aesthetic. Their librarians also have a special psyker ability called Farsight, also called the Hunter's Gaze, to increase their sniping range by honing onto targets psychically. This is an interesting note for two reasons. First, it doubles down on the inherent psychic nature of Corax's kids, and secondly, because the Raven Guard usually don't use librarians, which means that this is a special mutation within the Raptors. To explain the Knights of the Raven, I first have to talk about a different chapter, the Dark Angels. People often don't like the initial Dark Angel-focused books in the Horus Heresy, but Caliban, their home planet of Techno-Knights, as well as unique magical beasts on it, was one of my favorite settings, only to see it be turned into just another Imperial world before eventually being nearly destroyed, turned into the Rock. The Knights of the Raven recruit from a world called Coralax, which is basically just a what if Caliban never stopped being that cool Fallout England found in the first two Dark Angels books, with some elements from ancient Greece thrown in for good measure. They are literal Dark Knights who aspire to die in service to the Emperor and within the rites of their culture ascend to the state of mythological heroes or minor gods after death. They highlight the cultural and familial loyalty inherent to the Raven Guard through their own propagation of Kiavahan culture in the main chapter. Their color scheme heavily resembles another of my favorite chapters, the Grey Knights. The Black Guard are easily the most directly linked to the Primarch outside of the main chapter. They were originally the personal bodyguards of Corvus Corax, and their leader, Gareth Arendi, embodies the healthiest possible form of rebellion against authority. His life story is another example of Corvus's wisdom. Their tactical connection comes from their specialization, which is guerrilla warfare. In this case, it means they're less stealthy and more shoot then leave, shoot then leave. Arendi is best described as an expert tactician who thought of his ability as a form of cowardice when he was actually an expert at escape and creating diversions. This is because of his involvement in the drop site massacre, when he used battles that Marines were in to get his already critically injured body away from the war zone and escape. This gave him a survivor's guilt, which was worsened when he was rewarded for his service by being given the position of head of the Shadow Wardens, the bodyguards previously mentioned. After 40K's version of Dr. Frankenstein came after Corvus with his gene-enhanced soldiers, Arendi would save Corvus's life by disregarding a direct order. If you put yourself in his shoes, this would feel like the action that would damn his soul as a traitor in addition to his own self-image as a coward. However, no matter how much he thinks he will regret it later, he chooses the practical option, which preserves the most life. His reward for this, after the Legion was split into multiple chapters due to the Codex Astartes being enacted, was to become the leader of the Blackguard chapter, made up of those members of the Shadow Wardens and those they were close to in the chapter. This would be the completion of his own hero's journey internally, and likely a huge boost to his self-confidence. They have a very unique color scheme of mostly white with black arms, shoulders, and head. While only talked about in the Raven Guard collection stories, there is a mysterious cult of mad scientists that ironically worships Corvus Corax as a god, that enact their worship by recreating the Raven Guard abomination experiments. They see the creation of the abominations as emulating their view of divinity. When one ties this to the analysis we've made previously of Corvus Corax as a possible god in his own right when fully manifested, this is a great dynamic to play with in a tabletop setting. Since they are unnamed for the sake of this video, we'll call them the Cult of Corax. Of course, the Chaos Legions that they have a special hatred of are the Alpha Legion, who make a great enemy due to their espionage, Night Lords, who are good enemies for their stealth, Iron Warriors, who were the first wave of surprise betrayals at Istvaan, and Word Bearers, who would be the chapter's first encounter with true Chaos cults and demons. Alright, so I have no idea how well this video will do, but it was a lot of fun to make. In that spirit, I'd like to thank Arthur Bones and Chrono the Harlequin, as well as the gentlemen at the Lore Crimes podcast, who all invited me to a private Discord and reinvigorated my love for 40k by showing me their own in-progress works. A special thank you as well to the Gaming Storyteller for this Raven Rave edit I never got an opportunity to use. If you have any thoughts, please post them below. What is your favorite thing about the Raven Guard, if you have one? Are you a Raven Guard enjoyer? If so, why or why not? Let me know in the comments below. Lastly, of course, I have to thank all of you for watching. Without you, I wouldn't have reached the channel's 25k milestone. So once again, thank you for watching, and have a lovely night.